But Jay, we heard from two of the Husker coaches today.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, we'll take one of them now because he did a thing that I'm curious. I want your player response and then coach's response from. But EJ and Evan Cooper both talked. Evan Cooper did a thing. We'll talk about EJ and what he said about the running back room at 5 o'clock. But here I want to ask you quickly because as the incoming defensive backs coach, replacing somebody that was of importance here with high notoriety, but he did a thing and I want your take on it. He said, I've already met with Buford, Newsom, and Hartzog.
Yeah.
He didn't mention some other people.
Well, yeah. Well, they might not be back though.
That's what I'm going to ask you. So he didn't mention Farmer. He didn't mention Singleton. He didn't mention Clark. He didn't mention Brown. He didn't mention Noah Pola Gates. He didn't mention Tyreek Johnson. What does it mean for a player? Pause. We'll give the station ID, but I'm going to ask you, what does it mean? Because that's 6 names that were not mentioned out of that room that are on scholarship.
This is Lincoln's home for sports talk on the FM dial. Also online at theticketfm.com. On the internet, KNTK FM Firth, 93.7 The Ticket.
Okay, Jay Foreman, let me say it to you. Give it to me. What does it mean? If you're one of the other players, what are you thinking if the new head coach doesn't mention your name in that space?
Well, it just kind of depends who you are. I mean, I'm assuming a lot of those guys they're not around because they get quite a long break for Christmas break. So I'm sure nothing's mandatory until they know when they have their first team meeting, which is probably here pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
So
I mean, he mentioned Quentin Newsom. He mentioned
right, but I'm sure. But again, if I'm Miles Farmer and I'm at home, I'm not really worried about it because he started last year. If I'm the other guys, if he didn't meet with you, it's one thing.
Like
but
he mentioned those 3.
But if he did meet with you
and didn't call you out,
yeah, then it's a little different. But look, when coaching changes, it's there's a lot of change, and we'll see where it goes. I think he's got his work cut out for him, and so do the players. If I could give the players any advice, I'd meet with them, get to know them as much as possible. Don't be standoffish, and don't try to carry any ill will into your first interaction with them, because as much as you're grading the coach on what he says and does and your first initial reaction, he's doing it with you.
Mm-hmm.
He's also trying to see some maturity from you. Are you available? Do you return phone calls and texts? How engaged are you, and how much are you willing to adjust to get up and meet with him, either prior to you leaving Christmas break or not, and that all depends on if the coach said kind of sent out a mass text to all the guys and say, hey, I'm your coach, I'm available, this and this, and if you kind of blew it off or not. So look, I will say this, if you look at the tea leaves or listen, if you really listen, here's what I always say about coaches: if you really listen to them, they'll tell you everything.
They're giving you a game plan.
They'll give you the game plan. They'll give you what you think about a player, X, Y, and Z, just by their body language and tone. Quite frankly, obviously you could tell what Matt Rule feels about Jeff Sims as a quarterback versus Casey. I think he'll be pleasantly.
See, get out of my head, because
I'm not getting in your head. I'm just going.
No, that's the third. That's the third. That's the second segment of the hour.
Yeah, it's gonna be.
Was to ask you about that.
We're gonna. I'm gonna hit that one pretty. I'm gonna hit that pretty hard.
Yeah.
Before I go, probably since I had that wine, I'll probably end up getting a technical here. 5:45, but I think look, man, I've been through it. I remember being in Buffalo where we had a lot of continuity. Wade Phillips, Ted Cottrell, and all those guys, and the GM got fired, and then we had Music City Miracle. Next year we missed it. Wade kind of spoke out of turn. We missed the playoffs by 1 game. Greg Williams comes in. Had a new linebacker coach, and so you're starting. As much as you did in the years prior, you still have a new coach. So there's no allegiance to you, and it depends on where you're at in the depth chart. Keith Newman, who was an outside linebacker, was kind of more of a cemented starter. Even though I had logged more playing time, he was drafted higher than I was. Sam Coward, who was a second team All Pro. He was the middle. And then they had drafted a guy in my position, and even though I'd started majority of the season prior and had a good year, I was kind of like the lower guy, right? But then so that can you, when I, at that time it was like kffl.com. So when I saw like, I had experience with it when they were talking about players that they kind of Greg Williams is talking about, or Jerry Gray at the time, the defensive coordinator, my name was it, like wasn't one of the ones that came to the forefront. I just used it as motivation. And then by the time that, all said and done, it worked out pretty well. So I think you go in and your best influence is what you do in the weight room, on the field,
Film room,
and in the film, the classroom, and how you operate outside of the football, your everyday life, and it'll work itself out if you really want it.
Quickly, we'll have about a minute and a half. I'll ask you this question because you mentioned text, phone calls. In this day and age where communication through the pandemic, we now understand that Zoom calls fix a lot of things, right?
They
Fix a
still
lot
doing
of
it
things.
right now.
What do you say? What excuse is there for a coach to not have gotten all of his players on at least one Zoom call by now?
Well, it's twofold. There's no excuse for the coach not to be communicating and for the players not to reciprocate that.
Or to initiate.
Like
it speaks volumes to have a player do that.
On both ends.
Right?
On both ends.
Like I wanted to set that as a thing.
It's a relationship now. It doesn't go one way. You know what I mean? The door isn't open in just one way. That door is opened and closed both ways. So it's got to be both. And it
might be, and to answer to Texas says, hey, fellas, is it possible that they've identified these guys as leaders and he's trying to build leadership in that room with specific guys? Well, if he's identifying them as the leaders, that means he's excluding some people. And that's a statement too. A statement too, that you weren't included, that a fourth starter and your nickel guys, and two guys that are going to be considered in that space were not considered in the leadership group. That is a statement, and it better be paid attention to. Like, it's a big deal because I guarantee you, if he's identified 3 of the 4/5 starters as leaders, you better believe those 3 have input on who the 4th and 5th guys are going to be behind that play with them. You better understand that.